The dashboard is the tab where you can see a comprehensive summary of the emissions of all data that you have input into the tool so far. So you can see this in 4 different formats. You have the overall carbon footprint, which will give the emissions from all overheads and all projects that you've input into the tool between a specified start and end date. Then you can also see a project-specific carbon footprint, so the emissions from a specified project between a start and an end date. And then if you move down, you can do the same for a client carbon footprint. So this will be a sum of all emissions from all projects that are undertaken for a specific client. And similarly, we have the locational carbon footprint, which will be the emissions from all projects that are undertaken within a specified location. So if I just demonstrate on the overall carbon footprint first, we can see that the first drop down is present when producing a footprint within any of these 4 formats. So we've got a market-based versus locational-based carbon footprint to choose from. This was touched on in the overheads video, I do believe, but a market-based carbon footprint enables you to reflect any positive procurement choices that your organisation has made in terms of purchasing renewable electricity. So in a market-based footprint, if you're purchasing renewable electricity, your electricity emissions will be 0, whereas when reporting a locational-based carbon footprint, regardless of whether or not you purchase renewable electricity, you always take your electricity consumption and multiply it with the government-published emission factor, which reflects the energy mix of the average UK grid energy mix. So I'm going to choose market-based footprint here. And then let's choose a start and an end date. And then if you click go, you should see the table fill out and the charts to the right of the table should appear. So the table is split into 3 sections, or scopes as they are called under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So we have scope 1, which are the emissions from sources that a company owns or controls. So this is split into stationary combustion and mobile combustion, where stationary combustion is the combustion of fossil fuels in situ. So this is your natural gas consumption for heating in your office, or your fuel oil consumption for heating in the office, whereas mobile combustion is this project transport. So this is the litres of petrol, litres of diesel that are consumed by your vehicles when they're moving around to and from site or whatever. And then moving on to scope 2, these are the emissions from the generation of purchased energies. So typically this refers to electricity. In some cases this can refer to steam. However, we haven't included this in the tool as we do not believe it to be relevant to anybody. If this isn't the case, then do get in touch. But the electricity here is split into 2 sections. Electricity, which refers to electricity consumption in the office, and then electricity in electric vehicles. Scope 3 is then everything else, so the emissions that occur in the value chain, whether this be from purchased goods and services, commuting. I will actually just quickly run through all the categories. So we've got upstream leased assets, so this is when you lease a building from your landlord, but they just charge you a lump sum for utilities every month, or utilities are included in the rent, which means you are unable to separate you're not metered for your consumption, or you're not able to separate this. So you do not have operational control. This is when these emissions are put into the Scope 3 upstream leased assets category. Then moving on to overheads business travel, which we touched on in both the project transport video and also the overheads video. So business travel is transport in third-party operated vehicles. So this could be getting the train or flying from A to B. And then overheads business travel is any business travel that cannot be directly attributed to a specific project. So this could be getting the train to and from general business meetings or FAME conferences, in contrast to travelling directly to or from a project site. Moving on now to commuting, refers to staff commuting to and from offices. and also includes home working. And then we have upstream impacts. So the upstream carbon impacts of energy consumption are captured in two categories here. So we've got the overheads and then we've got project specific. So the upstream carbon impacts of energy consumption refer to the emissions associated with the production and distribution of energy, be this energy electricity, natural gas, petrol, diesel. So in terms of overheads, this will refer to your buildings, utility usage, whereas project specific will be the upstream impacts from getting the litres of petrol or diesel to your vehicles, which are then used to travel to and from project sites, for example. And then we have project transport. So we have grey fleet, which is when employees are using their personal vehicles for business purposes. Typically this is reimbursed at 45 pence a mile. And we have project related business travel, which we've already touched on. Moving on now, we have the different stages of a project lifetime as specified in the bill of quantities. So any inputs, any emissions in these categories will be from data input into either the bill of quantities core or optional inputs. They will typically refer to purchased goods and services. But we can see here that we have separated out plant hire. If you've seen the introduction video, then you will have seen the pie chart that we synthesized that was what we predicted a typical archaeology organisation's corporate carbon footprint to look like. And if you look at this, a significant proportion of this was plant hire, and we expect this to be the case across most projects and most organisations, hence why we've sort of separated it into its own category. And then coming towards the end here, we've got development emissions. Again, this was touched on in the introduction video, but development emissions are typically emissions for activities that would happen whether the archaeologists were there or not. So we're basically trying to avoid any emissions being unfairly allocated to archaeologists simply because they're the first people on site, and these sort of activities would have been happening anyway, even if the archaeologists didn't do their work there. So I think in the bill of quantities I gave the example of fencing. So if you're putting up loads of fencing, just because the archaeologists are the first people on site, we don't want all the emissions from all that fencing to be allocated to them if that fencing is going to be used for the duration of the project's lifetime. So then finally we have biogenic emissions. So these are currently reported as out of scope, but we're seeing indications that in the future they may be introduced into carbon footprinting. So we've sort of included them here as a precaution, I guess. And so within the tool, this refers to emissions from disturbing soil, for example, or also in electricity generation. If biomass is used, then there are some biogenic emissions associated with burning this biomass, and these are included here. So sort of a quick run through the table. And if we look to the right, then we have the charts. So the first one is a stacked bar chart, which just shows the year you have input as wanting to report on compared with the previous year. We can see here that I've not entered any data for 2023, so there's no comparison to be made. And then it's split down into the categories of the table. Then below that we have a pie chart which represents the breakdown per project within the reporting period. So we can see here that 97% of the emissions for 2024 were attributed to the Greenbelt project and only 3% to the motorway project. So I'm just going to change this to 2025 so that we can see the bar chart comparison. So we can quite clearly see that the 2024 bar just jumped across, and we can compare it to 2025. So obviously we can see here that you can input any time period. So if you input, for example, the first quarter of 25, then this will compare it to the first quarter of 2024. So it will just sort of minus a year from the first date that you put in. So now if we move across to the project footprint, the first step is to select the project you want to report on. Let's do the motorway, and then market-based or locational, and then your dates. So the table is much the same as for the overall footprint, except we can see that you've got a forecast column and an actual column. So this is required by the PAS 2080 requirements. So they require you to create a forecast footprint for a project for several reasons, including being able to identify the highest carbon emitting categories so that carbon reduction efforts can be sort of concentrated in this category, and then also to baseline it and be able to compare it with the actual emissions as the project progresses, so you can see the effects of any carbon reduction activities that you do undertake. And so we also have this column here, which shows the actual footprint as a percentage of the forecast. So, for example, we can see that with electric vehicles, the actual is 100% of the forecast, so they're the same. Whereas for project transport grey fleet, you can see that the actual emissions that were realised were greater than the forecast emissions. So you can see it's 124% there. So if we move over to the charts. So first of all, we have a breakdown. We have sort of combined some categories so that it's not an overwhelming pie chart. So we have the buildings emissions. So this is stationary combustion, electricity used in the buildings, upstream leased assets, overhead upstream impacts, I think that's all of them. And then you've got transport, which is the project transport, the electric vehicles, then you've got overhead business travel and the project transports here, and the upstream impacts for project specific activities. Commuting just includes the commuting category, and then purchase goods and services is everything else. Except for development and biogenic. Development we haven't put into this pie chart as these are emissions which aren't going to be directly attributed to the archaeology industry, but biogenic emissions are included and just include the final row in the column. So going back to this forecast versus actual sort of reporting requirement, we have these bar charts here which can just show you how each scope is doing when we look at the forecast emissions and the actual emissions to date. So we can see here that the actual emissions, scope 1 emissions, are significantly lower than the forecast ones, whereas for scope 3 there's not so much of a difference. Now if we go over to the client footprint, so again you need to select your client. So I've only input 2 projects at the moment into the database, and they're both for the same client and location. So that's why you can only see 1 client there. However, if you were to enter more projects, then the drop down would obviously increase. And then you can select your market based, and then again input your start and end date and click go. So table is exactly the same as for the project one, so I don't need to talk through anything there. And then we've got some similar charts here. So the difference between this table and the table I just showed you for the motorway project is this table will now include the emissions from the motorway and the Greenbelt project combined. So that's why these graphs are a little bit different. So we can see the forecast. So the actual emissions are in fact a lot greater than the forecast emissions now, and we include the Greenbelt. Similar for scope 3. And then we've got some different charts here. So this one on the right is exactly the same pie chart as shown above. So we've got the buildings, transport, commuting, purchase goods and services, and biogenic for both projects combined. And then this final pie chart just shows the breakdown for that client. So we can see that 97% of the emissions for that client were from the Greenbelt and 3% were from the motorway. Now this sort of aligns with what we had above, because for 2024, if I just bring this back up, we had that same 97%, 3%, because I have only input 2 projects into the database, which are these 2 projects. So all emissions for 2024 will be allocated within these 2 projects. And then the process is extremely similar for the locational footprint just to the right. Again, I think I just input both projects to the same location. So we should, in fact, just get exactly the same result as the table to the right, which we can see that we have. So again, the graphs are largely